Welcome back to our Sunday school class on critical race theory and anti-racism. This is our 5th lesson of the class and our second part on the history of CRT. So last week, we did not get nearly as far as I intended to. So we talked about the roots of CRT, critical race theory, in some of the 18th and 19th century. And we're going to find out, where did critical race theory actually come from? What does critical even mean? And so, we're going to look at some of those 20th century roots. And also, if we have enough time, we'll see how it's expressed in modern movements today, particularly such as critical social justice. So if you weren't with us last week, what I covered was a chart that I have created for my classes at Westminster Academy. And this is my attempt to summarize the history of Western thought in 4 stages. So we looked at the pre-modern / pre-liberal worldview. We looked at the modern or classical liberal worldview. We looked at the postmodern worldview, and then what I'm calling the post-postmodern worldview. And there are a number of names we could call that final stage. I've also heard it called critical postmodernism. I've heard it called critical neo-Marxism. It goes by a number of names. We're not quite sure what to call it, but the name I'm going with, which I get from Thaddeus Williams, is post-postmodernism. And so I'm not going to review this entire chart with you. I think we spent like 20 minutes on it last time. So I'm just going to keep moving ahead, but keep this in mind. It's on your printout. I will be referring back to it in the course of this class. I also used this analogy to describe the origin of critical race theory. We can understand the history of these ideas in terms of a tree. The roots go back to Enlightenment-era thinkers like Rousseau and Marx, and you could add some other names to that too. I think of Hegel in particular. But I also argue that the ideas that we're seeing today, although they had their roots in these Enlightenment thinkers, the trunk would be critical theory. And we're going to talk about that trunk today, because they all trace back to those Enlightenment thinkers through the emergence of critical theory. And so you have to understand what we mean by critical theory. Now, we talked about Rousseau. I'm not going to say everything that I said last time, but just to recap, Rousseau is significant because he presented a fundamentally different understanding of human nature. He understood humans as inherently good and corrupted by society. So the problems we witness in society today are externally caused, not internally caused. And so he would place the blame on social conventions and civilization. So these ideas we have about, say, private property or monogamy are actually social conventions that harm us. They actually prevent us from being our true primitive selves. And so he argued that the solution is not to give more power to the state. He argued that we need to submit ourselves to what he called the general will, the idea that we need to sacrifice our political liberties for the sake of our moral liberties. In a nutshell, that's my presentation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Karl Marx is also hugely significant. In particular, his analysis of society in terms of a dialectic. Okay, when I say dialectic, think of conflict, think of tension, think of a clash of different classes. So on his understanding, history is the unfolding of conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. And at each stage in history, that conflict might look differently. And each conflict resolves itself by giving birth to a new stage in history. And he predicted that there would be 6 stages in history, beginning with what he called primitive communism. Then you have slave society, which then gives rise to feudalism. Stage 4 would be capitalism, which is what we are in today in the West. Then you have the proletariat revolution, and then finally you have true communism. He thought that all of history was inevitably heading towards this true communist society. And he understood society in terms of 2 elements. Every society consists of these 2 elements, a base and a superstructure. The base would be the means of production and the relations of production. So who controls the wealth, who produces the wealth, and what are the conflicts that emerge from that? That's the base of society. The economics of society determine every other aspect of society, and that would be the superstructure. So superstructure would consist of all the aspects of culture. So art and education, law, religion, all of that falls into the superstructure of society, which serves to maintain the base. but the base is what determines the superstructure. So there's sort of like this feedback loop between the two. That's Marx's understanding. And if you want to understand what happens in critical theory, you have to get those concepts. So keep those ideas in mind. The concept of dialectical materialism and the base and superstructure of society. Now we're going to move into the 20th century. Because as we see what happens in the course of the 20th century, Marx's predictions were not coming true. We did not actually see a proletariat revolution. We did not see, that never happened even in the communist societies like in Russia or China. What happened was you had this elite vanguard class. That's the concept behind Bolshevism, that you need a new aristocracy to jumpstart the revolution. And so you have Marxists in the West, and this is where we get into the field known as Western Marxism or neo-Marxism, which then gave rise to what we can call cultural Marxism. I'm going to highlight a couple of the thinkers in this movement. In particular, a name you need to know is Antonio Gramsci. Now, he was the head of the Communist Party in Italy when Mussolini rose to power. And he was imprisoned, and I believe, as I recall, he died in prison in 1937. But during his imprisonment, he wrote several notes on his reflections on society and Marxism, and he was trying to make sense of why the proletariat revolution never happened. And here was his conclusion. He develops this notion called cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony is, here's my definition of it, it's the imposition of the ruling class's value system, their ideology, upon society via the various institutions of society, such that the subordinate class unwittingly consents to this system and embraces it as its own. Other thinkers have called this false consciousness. For example, Friedrich Engels called it false consciousness. It's also, in more recent years by critical theorists, called internalized oppression. In other words, the ruling class brainwashes the subordinate class so that the subordinate class thinks that the status quo is actually in their interest, that it actually benefits them. So rather than seeking revolution, they're seeking to maintain society as it is. And so, essentially, here's what happens, and here's the definition of cultural Marxism. You remember how Marx defined society in terms of the base and the superstructure? Turn that upside down, and you have cultural Marxism. Okay, so that the base is actually the institutions of society. That's education, it's law, it's entertainment and the arts. All of those features of society are now producing a certain mindset that continues to perpetuate the economic relations of society. And so, rather than trying to violently overturn the base, which is what Marx was predicting, Antonio Gramsci is advocating a different strategy. If you want to achieve liberation in the communist sense of that term, you need to infiltrate the institutions of society. You need to actually work gradually, progressively, through these cultural institutions in order to achieve the necessary consciousness that will then lead to revolution. Is this concept making sense? This is my crash course, my attempt to very much simplify what Gramsci is teaching. You might have heard the expression, the long march through the institutions. That idea is very Gramscian, but the expression itself actually goes to a 1960s Marxist student activist in Germany by the name of Rudi Dutschke. But he was very much influenced by Gramsci. So that idea that we need to infiltrate the institution, cultural Marxism, and that goes back to Gramsci. Now, Gramsci is often confused with the movement known as critical theory or the Frankfurt School, and he is very much in this stream of thought, although technically, being in Italy, he's not a part of what we call the Frankfurt School or critical theory proper, although they do get lumped together in discussions on this. But if you want to know what critical theory is, look to the Frankfurt School in the 1920s and 30s in particular. You have individuals like Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer. There's a few other individuals as well, like Walter Benjamin and so forth. These are the guys who give rise to what we call critical theory. Now, they are neo-Marxists. They established this organization called, if I remember right, their term for it was the Institute for Social Research. But it became more popularly known as the Frankfurt School. So these were neo-Marxists who were sort of embracing these ideas that were first pioneered by Gramsci and trying to chart a new course for Marxism. They are now recognizing that a proletariat revolution is not going to happen, and so they need to figure out some other way of critiquing and transforming society. So they develop what they call a critical theory. And here's the definition of critical theory. So if you want to know what the critical in CRT stands for, here it is. This is my summary, and as I recall, this definition goes back to Horkheimer. But you can also look this up. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a resource online that summarizes their thinking. And so there are three elements to a critical theory in their terms. A critical theory is one that analyzes society on these principles. It must be normative, explanatory, and practical. Add those three up and you have what's called a critical theory. What do I mean by these? Okay, let me unpack them briefly. It must be normative in the sense that you can't simply study society from this supposedly neutral or objective point of view. You have to recognize that you can never completely separate fact from value. This notion of the separation of fact and value is an Enlightenment ideal, according to these guys. They're arguing, in particular, it goes back to David Hume. He's well known for this separation of fact from value. And they would argue you cannot study society that way, that every analysis of society contains within it certain norms, a certain value system. And that is a necessary element in studying society. So this whole notion of trying to be unbiased, they would argue is an illusion. You can't actually be unbiased. Now let me pause there and ask you, as Christians, could we agree with that claim? I think so. I think we can agree there is no such thing as pure neutrality. We don't, as Christians, we don't hold to a pure fact-value split. However, from a Christian standpoint, we recognize they're operating from the wrong norms. Okay, their normative system is Marxism. From a Christian worldview, and more broadly from a pre-modern worldview, you may remember that an element of the pre-modern worldview is this notion of teleology, right? That you can't fully understand a thing unless you know what that thing is for. What is its ultimate purpose? But in the pre-modern worldview, that purpose is metaphysically or supernaturally imposed. It's our Creator that tells us what our purpose is. That's not something we decide for ourselves. What critical theorists try to do is, if I can say this, they immanentize our teleology, right? In the sense that they argue that we determine our purpose, we are the ones who set the standards for where society should be heading, and so it's a secularization of this concept of teleology. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what I mean by normative. Now, explanatory, what they mean by that is society must always be, and some of the terms they might use would be interrogated or deconstructed. That is, you have to look below the surface to understand how society is actually working. You have to actually understand what are the incentives, what are the motives that are at work, and this is what gives rise to a very cynical mindset. And I think this is really inherent in the way we understand CRT today. It's a cynical analysis of society because it assumes that people are fundamentally driven by power. And so when they look at the institutions within society, when they interrogate them or deconstructing, they're looking at who is served by maintaining the status quo, who actually benefits from this, who gains power. Now, are those questions wrong? No, they're not. Those are useful questions. Okay, so I'm not dismissing that concept entirely. However, we also have to recognize, you see how that can also be a recipe for paranoia? Like there is a point at which we still have to look at arguments on their own merits. And I think one of the problems with this approach is it moves beyond the arguments per se, and it's looking towards what are the motives of the arguer. And I don't think that's the proper place to start. There is a place for doing that at some point in the conversation, but we still need to deal with arguments on their own merits. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems within critical theory in general. It doesn't deal with the arguments on their merits in the proper order. Does that make sense? Okay. And then practical. This kind of goes in line with the other elements. Theory must always be wedded to praxis. Praxis is a term that critical theorists love to use. And what they mean by that is your ideas must necessarily give rise to or move towards liberation of society. And if they're not moving in that direction, then you're maintaining the status quo, you're serving the oppressive interests. And so they are, again, they're trying to move away from this modernist notion of neutrality, where you can sort of do, armchair social theory. The idea that we can simply look at society, analyze it without any sort of investment in what happens in society. And so they are pushing back against that. Now again, could Christians in some sense agree with that concept? Yeah, absolutely. However, again, you have to recognize the problem that they're with this mindset is the underlying worldview that they're operating from. Okay, so their understanding of oppression and liberation is defined in Marxist terms. It's in terms of this concept of a dialectical materialism. And because that's their starting point, although there is truth in each of these elements, the way that they are applying them is harmful and is antithetical to a Christian worldview. That's my summary of critical theory. Is that making sense? So if somebody were to ask you, what does the critical in critical theory mean? You have something to give them now, okay? Now, these guys, like Adorno and Horkheimer, they were the first generation of the Frankfurt School. But the Frankfurt School persisted for a number of decades, and perhaps its leading proponent is a guy named Herbert Marcuse. How many of you have ever heard the name Marcuse? Very well-known philosopher. He actually he lived in North America for a time, and he has come to be known as the father of the new left. So think of a lot of like the student activist movements in the 1960s. He was sort of the intellectual influence on those movements, and he is still influential today. And so I've actually read a couple of his essays in preparation for this class. I read an essay of his called Repressive Tolerance. And here's my attempt to summarize the main argument of his essay, Repressive Tolerance. He's looking at how a liberal society, a classically liberal society, tolerates dissent within it. How do we impose censorship? How do we tolerate those who disagree with us? And he's looking at how that works in Western capitalistic societies, and he's arguing that our notion of tolerance is really maintaining the interests of the status quo. And so we need to radically transform our understanding of what repression and tolerance and censorship actually mean. So here's a quote from his essay. In a truly liberated society, now keep in mind, what does liberation mean here? Communism. In a truly liberated society, tolerance cannot be indiscriminate and equal with respect to the contents of expression, neither in word nor in deed. It cannot protect false words and wrong deeds, which demonstrate that they contradict and counteract the possibilities of liberation. Marcuse is hard to read, okay? Most of his paragraphs and sentences, I needed to read twice to begin to understand what he was trying to say. But when you break down what he's trying to say, you realize just how troubling these ideas can be. Do you know what he means by this? What he means by this is that we need to hold to double standards when it comes to tolerance in society. He explicitly says that we need to tolerate dissent from the left, even violent dissent from the left, but not from the right. He's very explicit in the essay. Those were his words. We need to tolerate dissent from the left, but not from the right. And in doing so, we will move society more in the direction of liberation. And he's calling for a truly democratic society. Now, the way critical theorists use the term democracy is not what we think of by democracy, because keep in mind, they think that our society's been brainwashed. You may think that you're consenting to our system, but you're not. Okay, those who hold power in society have basically imposed their values on you. So there's that cultural hegemony, going back to Gramsci. And so you think that this society is benefiting you. You think it's in your interest, but it's really not. So you're not really consenting to it. You can't consent to it because of these prevailing structures in society that are imposing their values on you. And so in order to achieve true liberation, we're going to need to allow movements and ideas that seem to undermine your interests and which you may not consent to, at least not now. But when we achieve that liberated society, then you'll realize that this really has been in your benefit all along. Do you see how horrific that idea is? Any totalitarian could take this argument and use it to their advantage, on the left or the right. Really, depending on how you define your terms, liberation, yes, that's why this is such a dangerous idea. Let me show you an essay that he wrote a little bit later. This is just a small excerpt from his essay on liberation, which I also read just a couple weeks ago. Now, again, his language is very dense. It's very technical. He's hard to understand sometimes, but when you break down his ideas, you realize how troubling these concepts really are. So here's what he says in his essay on liberation. And he's developing this notion that he calls the Great Refusal. He's looking at these revolutionary movements in the 1960s, these activist movements, and how they're rejecting not only like corporate capitalism in the West, but also like bureaucratic Stalinism in like the Soviet Union, for example. So he's not a fan of Stalin. Interestingly, he is a fan of Mao. I guess he doesn't realize just how violent the Cultural Revolution was in China at this time yet, though. But Mao was not much better. He might have actually been worse than Stalin. Yeah, so anyway, here's a quote from his essay on liberation, so you get a sense of what he's saying. For the world of human freedom cannot be built by the established societies. And so he's critiquing both the capitalist West and like the Stalinist Soviet Union, no matter how much they may streamline and rationalize their dominion. Their class structure and the perfected controls required to sustain it generate needs, satisfactions, and values which reproduce the servitude of the human existence. This voluntary servitude, in quotes there, voluntary inasmuch as it is introjected into the individuals, which justifies the benevolent masters, he's being sarcastic there, can be broken only through a political practice which reaches the roots of containment and contentment in the infrastructure of man. A political practice of methodical disengagement from and refusal of the establishment, aiming at a radical transvaluation of values. Such a practice involves a break with the familiar, the routine ways of seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding things so that the organism may become receptive to the potential forms of a non-aggressive, non-exploitative world. Yeah, non-exploitative in his terms. We might feel differently about that, though. Okay, do you see what he's arguing here? This is the problem that Marxists in the mid-20th century were trying to grapple with. The fact was that capitalism was working. It was delivering the goods it promised. It was raising people out of poverty. It was lowering infant mortality. It was providing health benefits. It was delivering the goods. And that made the working class happy. And this infuriated the Marxists because it was sapping them of their revolutionary energy. So rather than being a force for revolution, they were being a force to maintain the status quo. And so Marcuse is upset by this, and he's arguing that they're being brainwashed. And so what we need to do is sort of awaken a new consciousness within people so that they will realize the oppressive nature of this status quo of corporate capitalist societies so that they will seek a liberation. Is this sounding familiar, by the way? Like, can you see how these ideas have actually influenced the way people are talking today? Yeah, like the Matrix. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, these ideas are tremendously influential in understanding these social justice, critical social justice movements today. So a lot of this goes back to Marcuse. Another name, this guy is not on your printout, but I just read a book of his this past week called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is another hugely influential book in the movement known as critical theory. And in particular, Paulo Freire is considered the godfather of a subdiscipline known as critical pedagogy. Pedagogy just means educational theory, if you're not familiar with that. So he wrote this book, which was translated into English in 1970, called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the reason this book is so significant, it's not that hard to read. He's easier to read than Marcuse, I would say. But you also have to recognize the way he uses his terms is heavily loaded with Marxist ideology. And he acknowledges that. He is influenced by Marxism. He's influenced by liberation theology, which is sort of a Christianized version of Marxism that came from Latin America in the 1960s with thinkers like Gustavo Gutierrez. And so What makes Freire's work so influential is he was the one who developed this concept of a critical consciousness. Now, the Portuguese word he used for it, which I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation here, is conscientização. I don't speak Portuguese, but I think that's the right pronunciation. But here's how he defines critical consciousness, or rather, it's how his translator defines it. Learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, that is, the Marxian dialectic, as we've talked about, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. In other words, he recognizes this problem that the Frankfurt School has identified, this problem of a false consciousness or internalized oppression, cultural hegemony. The subordinate classes have actually embraced the values of the dominant class, and that's a bad thing because that undermines the possibility of liberation. So how do you achieve the possibility of liberation? You first have to achieve a critical consciousness. That's why education becomes so important in critical theory. And in particular, you have the rise of this discipline known as critical pedagogy, because you need to awaken people to the systems of oppression in society. And that's what they call a critical consciousness. Why is this so important? Because critical consciousness is the technical term and theoretical foundation for what slang term that we use today? Woke. Okay? This is the theoretical foundation for wokeness. This idea of being able to analyze society in terms of systems of oppression and domination and subordination, and working to counteract that, to dismantle these oppressive systems. This goes back to Paulo Freire, okay? And that's why he's such an important and influential thinker in this movement. The next thinker that I want you to know about is Michel Foucault. He's one of the leading thinkers in postmodern theory. Now, there are several postmodern thinkers I could have identified. There's Jacques Derrida, there's Jean-François Lyotard. But I think in terms of influence on critical theories today, Michel Foucault is the dominant voice. And I'm just going to highlight one of the key ideas that he developed, this concept of power knowledge. Now, what he means by that is you can never understand systems of knowledge apart from their purpose in domination. So he would argue that knowledge claims, whatever they may happen to be, are grounded not in objective reality, but in contingent historical forces. So this sounds very relativistic, right? It is. That's what postmodern theory is built upon. He argues at any given time and place in history, the dominant group sets the terms for what can be known and what should be considered true or false, so that the society as a whole internalizes and institutionalizes the imposed ways of knowing as common sense. In other words, there's no such thing as objective truth, there's no such thing as objective knowledge. And I take that back. He would acknowledge maybe there is such a thing as objective truth, but we can never really know it, because our ways of knowing are always socially conditioned. They always serve some purpose for imposing power on others. And so based on this, whenever somebody puts forward a truth claim or a statement about what is good or just, he's going to try to look below the surface and try to see what's in that for you. How does that serve your purposes in imposing power on others? And can you see how this is very much in line with critical theory? So this is one of the main concepts that is further developed in this stream of critical theory. Now we're going to get into what we call critical race theory proper. Now, critical race theory has its roots in like the 1970s and 80s with legal scholars such as Derrick Bell. He's considered to be the godfather of critical race theory. So he's writing even before the formal beginning of CRT, which I think happened in 1989. But his ideas were tremendously influential on the critical race theorists who came after him. And I'm going to highlight one of the central ideas that he developed: interest convergence. And here's his definition of interest convergence from an essay of his that I just recently read. So here's a book on some of the primary sources on critical race theory. This thing is massive, I know. I haven't read the whole thing, but I've read select essays from it, including his essay. So the book is Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Formed the Movement, edited by Kimberlé Crenshaw and others. And Crenshaw, she is the one who coined the term critical race theory. And she's on my next slide. But Derrick Bell, in several of his essays, develops this concept of interest convergence, which he defines in this way. The interests of blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. Okay, so here's an example that he points to in his writings. Look at like Brown versus Board of Education, in the 1950s, the Supreme Court ruling, and other movements at that time for racial integration. He argues that these efforts towards racial integration are really just a product of Cold War interests, because white Americans simply wanted to head off Soviet accusations of hypocrisy and inequality, which undermine America's efforts to win allies abroad, especially in third world countries. Okay, so in other words, and this is partly true, what was happening in the mid-20th century was the Soviet Union was accusing Americans of hypocrisy because we claimed to be standing for equality, but we weren't. I mean, if you look at what was happening, with our segregation laws in the Jim Crow South, and also segregation in the North, which was happening as well in different forms, especially residential segregation, which we'll get into later. He's arguing that the thing that ultimately galvanized white Americans to support racial integration was not so much a concern for principles of equality, which he thought were really just a smokescreen or a ruse. It was really our effort to maintain credibility with allies abroad so that the Soviets would no longer have this accusation they could use against us as a weapon. We are the true champions of equality, and that's the message we're trying to communicate to the world, and so we're going to work towards these racial reforms very begrudgingly, according to Bell, in order to make sure that the Soviet accusations against us don't stick. Now, again, I'm not saying this is completely false. There's probably some element of truth in this, but do you see how this is a profoundly cynical analysis of American history? He doesn't think that white Americans were really inspired by these more fundamental principles about equality that we truly valued, and we're seeking to be more consistent in our application of these values. Right? He argues it was really just about what's going to benefit whites, what's going to help us maintain our credibility, what's going to serve our interests abroad. And so it's not that this idea, same with many of the other ideas coming out of CRT, it's not that they're entirely false. There are elements of truth in these ideas. But the problem is that if you reduce your analysis to these concepts, it's going to reinforce paranoia, it's going to reinforce division, it's going to reinforce grievances, and I don't think this is going to be the path that will actually achieve racial unity in America. So, and we'll unpack this in the course of this class as we go. Okay, a couple other names I want you to know about will be Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic. They were some of the architects of critical race theory as well. They wrote kind of the definitive introductory textbook on critical race theory, which is just called Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. It's a very readable, very accessible book if you're interested in hearing about CRT from their perspective. This is a great resource to go to. Here, I'm just going to highlight one of their key teachings, which is the social construction thesis. They're not the only ones who taught this idea. This is widespread in CRT. But the idea is also known as anti-essentialism. And they're arguing that race is a social construct. They would argue that rather than having a fixed basis in biology or phenotype, that is, the visible expression of racial difference, they argue racial categories developed during the modern period for the purpose of legitimating the oppression of one race by another. Now let me ask you, could we agree with that definition? Would we say that race is a social construct? Yeah, at least partly, to a certain extent. Again, the problem is I think they're being a little bit reductionistic here. It is true, the social meaning that we gave to racial differences, that was just a product of history, right? But at the same time, there are real differences between races. I mean, and they're visibly obvious, right? You can recognize what race a person belongs to just by looking at them. That's not purely a product of social conditioning, right? So, and that's why I think, although they're getting at an element of the truth, there's also an aspect that they're missing, because keep in mind that one of these ideas that developed in related fields to CRT, within CRT but also related fields like critical whiteness studies, is this idea that whiteness is oppressive. Are you a little bit offended when you hear that statement? Yeah. And why is that? because you know that that statement is actually criticizing you for something you cannot change about yourself. If something is purely a social construct, you can change it, right? You're never going to be able to change the color of your skin, though, right? And so that's why I think we cannot reduce racial categories to purely social constructs. They are identifying real, visible aspects that distinguish people. Now, the social meanings that we give to them, I agree with this, that the social meanings that we gave to race, especially in the early modern period, that was racist. That did serve purposes of oppression, okay? But that doesn't mean that race is purely a social construct. Now, this concept of the social construction of race, I want you to see, this is a relevant quote on that concept that comes from one of the leading activists for anti-racism today, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I know his name looks like it's pronounced Ta-Nehisi. It's not. It's pronounced Ta-Nehisi Coates. A book of his that I read this past summer called Between the World and Me. This is where he sort of develops this notion of the social construction of race. And this is a frequently quoted defense of the social construction thesis. He says, race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy or physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old. So he is acknowledging that aspect. But the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, this is the new idea at the heart of these new people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. Now, there's an element of truth here that we could agree with. I mean, the meaning that we gave to racial differences, yes, that was a social construct. But you cannot just dismiss the concept of black or white as purely social constructs. Those are referring to real differences between people. So we cannot purely define racial differences in terms solely of a hierarchy. I mean, if we can recognize that there were unjust, oppressive meanings given to race within the history of the West, and particularly in America. So the question we now have to ask ourselves is, what do we do about that? Do we just invert the morality, the moral polarity of these terms, so now whiteness used to be a good thing and now it's a bad thing? Or do we just simply try to move beyond that and say, let's stop investing these concepts of race with moral significance? Notice there are two choices we have before us. We can either say we were wrong about investing, moral significance into these categories, or we can try to reverse the moral significance of those categories. CRT and critical whiteness studies are trying to do that latter move. And I don't think that is the path towards true racial justice. Okay, another name that you need to know about within the field of critical race theory, I've mentioned her name already, is Kimberlé Crenshaw. She's the one who actually coined the term critical race theory, and if I remember right, this was at a legal conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1989. That was the formal beginning of CRT as a legal movement. She is also known for developing this concept known as intersectionality. How many of you have heard of the term intersectionality? You might have also sometimes seen critical race theory abbreviated as CRT/I. This is the I. And intersectionality, in her terms, would be an individual's various identity statuses may overlap in complex ways, producing unique forms of oppression and privilege. In other words, let me give you an example of what we mean by this. A white woman may experience patriarchal oppression, and a black man may experience racial oppression. But a black woman experiences a third unique form of oppression at the intersection of patriarchy and racism, in addition to experiencing patriarchal and racist oppression. Okay? So one of the ways I think the intersectionality is sometimes mischaracterized is as if you just stack up privilege points, which that's not accurate. It's not to say, okay, so you have one privilege point if you're a racial minority, you have another racial point if you're female, another point if you're gay. It doesn't quite work that way. That's a simplistic way of understanding intersectionality. What they are arguing is that you experience unique forms of oppression if you happen to belong to multiple identity groups at the same time. Okay, so it's not just a cumulative or quantitative form of oppression, it's qualitatively different. Does that point make sense? I'm trying to present her idea fairly here. Now, question to you again, is there some element of truth in this? I think there is. In fact, let me give you an example from Scripture that I think kind of sort of gets at this concept of intersectionality. You guys know what's happening in Acts chapter 6? The story in Acts chapter 6 is where you have food distribution for the widows within the Jerusalem church, but one of a subgroup within of the widows is getting left out. They're being neglected. It's the Greek-speaking widows, right? The Hellenistic widows. And so it was for that purpose that the apostles appointed deacons so that they could oversee the needs of the widows so that the apostles could focus on preaching and teaching. You could argue that those women stood at the intersection of widowhood and Hellenism, right? In the sense that they were being neglected, they were being left out of the food distribution because of this unique status that they held to. You can call that intersectionality in a certain sense, but you also have to keep in mind that that differs from what a lot of critical race theorists are doing. If you remember what I said about identity politics a few weeks ago, the difference between marginalization in Scripture and marginalization in CRT is that in Scripture, it's circumstance-based, and in CRT, it's identity-based. So I think the statuses, the identity statuses of oppression and marginalization that they're identifying here are not always correct. Sometimes they're leaving out other more relevant marginalization statuses, such as family structure privilege, for example, two-parent privilege. And here's the thing to know about the solution to that problem. It wasn't to elevate the voices of one group over the other. It was to ensure that they were all treated equally according to the same standard, right? And so that's another difference between proponents of CRT. Right. I will say that, like, if you read some of the critics of intersectionality, like I've read like James Lindsay on this and Neil Shenvi, and they acknowledge there is a way we could affirm this concept, that sometimes these minority groups, they do fall through the cracks of our system, like our legal system or what have you. And that can happen, but that doesn't mean the solutions they're proposing are the right solutions. This is probably a good place for us to stop. I was going to share with you here, real quickly, I'll just show you. These are some of the leading thinkers today, some of the authors that are influential today, like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi. And these are some of the books that they're known for. These are hugely influential books today. And I would recommend to you that if you want to know what the advocates today are teaching, these are the 3 books that I'd recommend looking into. You got to exercise discernment when you read these books. I read these books last year, but these are the books that are the application of these ideas today in the movement that, in particular, DiAngelo has called critical social justice. But that's as far as I'm going to get today. So next time, we're going to talk about the theme of systemic racism, and we're going to unpack these core tenets of CRT. All right. I think we do need to close our time right now, so I can stick around for a few minutes if you still have questions or comments after the class, but let me close our time in prayer so that we can get ready for corporate worship. Father God, I do pray that as we study these topics, you would give us wisdom and discernment, but also grace and humility. Help us to be willing to critique ourselves first, to be willing to take the plank out of our own eye before we point out the speck in our brother's eye or our neighbor's eye. I do pray, God, that you would help us to seek truth on the foundation of your word. And I do pray, God, that you would fill us with your Spirit so that we could engage in these ideas wisely and graciously so that the truth would prevail. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.